This is the Neoliberal Around podcast. There were some things that you guys were supposed to do. I asked no, watch the film and answer the questions. According to the film Life and Death, who is to be blamed for Jamaica's slow development and dependency? Who is to be blamed for Jamaica's slow development and dependency? Of course, when we talk about dependency, the last class we defined dependency as a condition. The last class that I did with you, where I lectured with you guys before we had the guest lectures, we defined dependency as a condition in which a nation, people, or economy relies heavily on external powers, institutions, or countries for survival, development, trade, capital, security, legitimacy. Dependency often emerges from colonialism and is maintained through neoliberal globalization, facilitated by structural adjustment, creating debt, unequal trade, foreign investment, and so on and so forth. And we talk about dependency theory. To understand dependency theory is to understand what Ramesh Ramsawan have said about it in his book, The Challenge of Structural Adjustment in the Commonwealth Caribbean. He said, structural adjustment is the policy that was used as an economic policy to facilitate globalization, a kind of globalization that has enabled penetration from the global north into the global south, that has ultimately created debt and slow development. But structural adjustment issue, according to Ramesh Ramsawan in the book, The Challenge of Structural Adjustment in the Commonwealth Caribbean, he says, is not surprisingly one surrounded by intense controversy and emotion. This is because it does not concern simply economic policies or improving government performance within a country or a group of countries, but it brings into question basic economic philosophy and ideology, and may also involve the effective transfer of decision making from local hands. That's what structural adjustment, according to Ramesh Ramsawan, who is a dependency theorist. Okay, for him, he sees structural adjustment as a policy which has helped to enable globalization. But not only that, what it has done, it involves the effective transfer of decision making from local hands. If you watch the film Life and Death, they're telling you that, oh, Michael Mann, the former prime minister, was in the 1970s, and David Corr and so on were saying that our hands were tied. Our hands were tied. We couldn't do anything in order to act, because we accepted monies from the IMF and the World Bank to help offset serious financial burdens that Jamaica had and many Caribbean countries had in the 1970s as a result of OPEC that had cut their supply. Cut their supply, therefore raising the price of oil. And when you look, the Caribbean is heavily dependent on energy, on oil, okay, in order to supply the energy base. And so because of that, they had to go to the IMF and the World Bank because they had squandered, according to some people, any windfall profits that they have from the 1950s and the 1960s. Because in the late 50s and 60s, some Caribbean islands were growing, especially Jamaica. So as a result of that, the Caribbean countries, like they create IMF and the World Bank was created in the 1940s after the end of World War II in order to help to provide loan to the post-industrial countries to develop themselves, not necessarily to their colonies. And by the time the 1960s come around and we got independence and we move into the 1970s, there wasn't any. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank now was used as a way to provide capital or aid to loans to countries that were suffering from the crisis of the 1970s. However, when after World War II, post-industrial countries or the industrial countries went to these banks to get money to rebuild, they weren't tied to any conditionalities and conditions. However, when the Caribbean countries got independence and they were reeling from the effects of the oil price crisis in the 1970s, conditions were tied to it. Okay, they cannot invest in development. They cannot subsidize their farmers. Okay, and not only that, the WTO was created to ensure that globalization to help to ensure that everybody was playing by the same rules. However, what we find is that the WTO was only observing and monitoring countries of the global south, but the post-industrial countries weren't being monitored because they were allowed to invest in their farmers. They were allowed to invest in their manufacturing sectors. Okay, while our economies, we were playing by the rules, and we weren't allowed to. As a result, it creates a lopsided competitive event. So what Ramesh Ramsawan and other dependency theorists have theorized is that, and I should have been sharing my screen. Let me just share my screen real quickly so you can see. There we go. Share. Dependency theory. Let's push this to the side. So dependency theorists like Ramesh Ramsawan, he's saying that the structural adjustment policies and these kind of policies, all they did, they were strategy that involves the effective transfer of decision from local hands. So people locally couldn't make decisions. And you hear that theme being echoed by the Caribbean government of the 1970s and 80s and 90s. However, you watch the same Life and Death, the film, and in the film Life and Death, you hear some of the respondents, some of the characters who was interviewed for the film saying, in the documentary film, saying the Jamaican government and many Caribbean governments were weak-kneed and lack vision. They were weak-kneed and lack vision to have allowed themselves to be backed up in a corner where they acquiesce to the conditions, okay, the conditions of the loan by the IMF and the World Bank and so on and so forth, and the WTO. They acquiesced. They were weak-kneed and they lacked vision. And in a sense, I don't know if you agree. I agree with that determination in a sense. Okay. As much as they want to pass blame onto the IMF, and of course, I asked that question in the I asked that question. I asked the question, according to the film Life and Death, who's to be blamed for Jamaica's slow development and dependency? Is it Jamaican government? Well, the Jamaican government will not is not they're not going to say it's them, or is it, or and by extension Caribbean governments, because the film is based on a book written by Jamaica Kincaid about Antigua, and the same issue they face, the same issues. It's as if you can take Jamaica's experience of the 1970s and 80s with structural adjustment and the IMF and the World Bank, and and their experience with globalization and so on and so forth, and put it right into Antigua. This all these countries, and of course Michael Manley alluded to that. Okay, the experience was similar across the board. So do you blame the Jamaican government or the Caribbean government? Do you blame the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank? Um, uh, do you put it squarely at the feet of the colonialism and Europe? Or would you NAFTA, which means North America Free Trade Agreement, the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, and the US? Please use short answers, 2 to 3 sentences for each question. So, and that's something you guys probably will have to contend with. Who do you blame? The next one is, what is the relevance of cinema and film in creating change? What is the relevance of cinema and film in creating change? And of course, that's powerful. In your book, chapter 11 of the book, and before I even begin in chapter 11 of the book, the preface of the book of neoliberalism says, when we hear of the Caribbean, yes, we think of beautiful islands of paradise with sun, sea, and sand, reggae music, cannabis, and Irish people like Usain Bolt, people who are living out their best dream, desires, and lives. But this book analyzes this motif, because in an attempt to escape the adverse realities of poverty, inequality, and injustice, the people of the global south find themselves in north metropolises with very little agency and minimal change to their lives. In fact, except for the use of cleaning neoliberal waste, the immigrant from the global south, from the Caribbean, the immigrant is usually portrayed as an alien. Okay, that's a visual effect here. Powerful, that's powerful. Think about it. The immigrant is usually from the global south, is portrayed as an alien with 3 heads and big sharp teeth, seeking to steal and destroy the profit and disrupt society. Yes, as such, we will discuss Black and Brown and Pan-African struggle for economic prosperity, justice, and freedom, and consider efforts, abilities, or inabilities to chart their own futures. But look at the ambivalence here, and even in the film Life and Death, Stephanie Black points to this ambivalence. She points to this ambivalence, and I answered the question in chapter 11 of your book. It's called Cinema and Neoliberal Globalization. Can cinematic film be an effective tool in creating change in light of globalization? And in pages 266, I said, films such as Life and Death empowers or fills the void of contending, opposing voices that are invisible. The dominated class. Hence, there is a place for a film such as Life and Death that acts as a countervailing force and pivots the tide against the shores. Such films and their slantings are important because they give voice to the voiceless and serve as a mitigating, balancing force in the world that ostracizes and exploits the vulnerable. But they must do so objectively and reasonably, while maintaining the aim to provide social critique, for social change. Social critique for social change. That's what this film provides. Social critique for social change. I agree with the film's assertion. This is my response. I agree with the film's assertion that Jamaica is rich and poor at the same time. Jamaica is rich and poor at the same time. Isn't that crazy? Poverty is ubiquitous. Ubiquitous means it's everywhere. Okay, poverty is ubiquitous. And an abject state, a deep state, is not just ubiquitous, but it's deep at the same time. Poverty is ubiquitous and abject state that is difficult to overcome given the capitalist structures in which we find ourselves. And I go on by saying this oxymoronic tale, bittersweet, poor rich, paradise, but yet people escaping from paradise and find themselves in North metropolises. And okay, why should people escape from paradise? Okay, and of course, I find myself here in the US and they said, wow, Jamaica's so beautiful. Why you come here? Some people, when I just came, they would say that. This is oxymoronic. That's a figurative expression. Oxymoronic, bittersweet, yeah? And so I said, this oxymoronic tale is strange but true. This irony, it's ironic. Yes? This irony is visually represented in the film's mise en scène. In the film's mise en scène, where tropical beauty is juxtaposed with abject poverty throughout the film. Did you guys notice that? I'm going to talk a little bit about mise en scène. What is mise en scène? Okay, it's a French word. Everything within the film. Okay, everything that is within the film, everything that is in front of the camera. Okay, how the camera, how the film, how whatever is in front of the film, how it is organized, how the film is organized, how it is selective, the juxtaposition, okay, the barbed wire. Yes, that barbed wire is very important, When you see, when you watch film, you have to, I developed, I did a course called Cinema and Globalization in 2010 at the University of Pennsylvania. Powerful. And I learned about filmmaking and especially documentary film. And documentary film is revolutionary. It's a revolutionary film. It's in a sense, it's a kind of resistance. Yes? Anti-globalist. And so I'm going to say this again. I said, and by the way, when you read chapter 11 of the book, I said, probably the answer to neoliberalism lies in film. One of man's basic drive is the pursuit and discovery of truth. But in a world of isms and schisms, perceptions and deceptions, truth seems more elusive. Elusive means far-fetched or far. And reality becomes contradictions of our perceptions controlled by our ideologies, the products of human limitations. Nevertheless, throughout history, man has searched for truth. And according to Quandus Callison, film, art, and media have reflected this eternal search for truth. It is no wonder that Professor Bob Clifford would assert that documentary film is one of the major achievements of cinema and film. Implicit in this assertion is the argument posited by film scholars such as Vertov, Jean Rouch, Richard Leacock, and Fred Wiseman that documentary films seek for truth or realism that has never before been achieved or represented in films. Hence the term cinema verite or direct cinema, which uncovers the truth in cinema. This style of filmmaking, cinema verite, used a revolutionary style that exceptionalized and characterized documentary film from non-fictional films. It's not it's an it's part of anti-imperialist school of thought. Yes? So documentary film is strategic. It sought to override and impugn neoliberal propaganda and highlight globalization's devastating effects on the dominated global South and the Caribbean, whose countervalence tactics are futile against the bureaucratic phenomenon. What is the bureaucratic phenomenon? Do as I say, but not as I do. Yes, they, we want, you create World Trade Organization and that monitors, okay, how you do what you do, how you spend the money that we lend to you, and so on. You cannot invest in your local manufacturers because that is unfair competition. Yet they get to invest in their local manufacturers so that now they can offset the price of certain goods and services and bring it into the Caribbean and sell it for $1 when we don't, and we can't sell it for $1 because the cost of producing those very same goods is 20 and 50, is thousands of dollars. And so we want the money to invest in our local manufacturers and farmers, but we are not allowed to do that. But they get allowed to do it. That's the bureaucratic phenomenon. That's Pharisicalism. Pharisicalism. Yes? Do as I say, but not as I do. The film, in a sense, highlights that. And that is the Pharisaical nature of neoliberal globalization. Yes? And so I talk about that in film helped to expose the truth because film talks about it. Film champion globalization, and globalization is perfect for society. It's the sine qua non of development. Countries should plug themselves into global strategies, open up their economies to allow for trade. But that was a facade. It was a lie. Yes? Of course, the book talks about that. We can't delve into that. You can get the copy of the book and read it yourselves. But I talk about that here in the film, in the book. And I reference the film by looking at in chapter 11. But this part is important. Now, moving along, I said again, and I repeat myself, such films like Life and Death and Dirty Pretty Things, and so on and so forth, such films and their slantings are important because they give voice to the voiceless and serve as mitigating, balancing force in the world that exploits the vulnerable. But they must do so objectively. I move on by saying, I agree with Life and Death's assertion that Jamaica is rich and poor at the same time. Jamaica is rich and poor at the same time. Poverty is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. And an abject state, a deep state, that is difficult to overcome given the capitalist structures in which we find ourselves. This oxymoronic tale, oxymoron, bittersweet, this one, you're good in one sense and bad in the same sense. Oxymoronic tale. Yes? Jamaica, I said Jamaica is a paradise. We begin the book in the preface saying, when we hear of Jamaica or the Caribbean, we think of beautiful islands of paradise with sun and sea and sand and reggae music and cannabis and Irish people like Usain Bolt and people living out their best dreams, desires, and lives. But people are escaping. Why are people escaping from paradise? That's it. That's oxymoronic. That's oxymoronic. This irony, dramatic irony, is visually represented in the film's mise en scène, where tropical beauty is juxtaposed with abject poverty throughout the film. Throughout the film. I'm going to pause there for a moment because I'm like, what the hell is the professor talking about? Mise en scène and tropical beauty is juxtaposed with abject poverty. Juxtapose means side by side. When you look at film, it is edited, and documentary film like this one, it is edited in such a way to tell a story without you having to even see anything. The way how a documentary film or a film is pieced together It is pieced together for visual effects. Yes? So you look at the film. So I'm saying to you that, and by the way, let's talk about mise en scène. Let's talk about mise en scène for a little bit. When I talk about mise en scène, what am I talking about? Quickly. When we talk about mise en scène, what am I talking about here? And I wanna explain to you what mise en scène is. Mise en scène, and I was able to do, and I really appreciate Rita Bernard for explaining this. Mise en scène is a French term that means placing on the stage. In film, it refers to everything that appears within the frame and how those elements are arranged to create meaning and mood and effects. It's visual storytelling. So, what are the key elements of mise en scène? It is setting and location. Setting and location. Okay, where the scene takes place, the scenery, the architecture, the props, the people, what is being seen, what you see on the film. The Jamaican, you see what you see. The tourists are always smiling. They are coming and they're smiling and they're being titivated. Their egos are being stroked. While then the picture shifts to the Caribbean, to the Caribbean man, to the local. They're always working, and if they're smiling to please to please the tourist. Yes, they're smiling. It's important. Where the scene takes place, and then you look at the juxtaposition. You go to the north coast. Yes, in certain places there's a barbed wire. Okay, to protect and to wall off certain people from going. It is for the visitors, the white tourists who are visiting. The beauty is reserved for them. And then outside of that, you see outside of that, into Kingston or outside of that, you see people. There is always turmoil and vagabond, and it's for visual. If it is telling a story, juxtaposition, how it is the setting and the location, where the scene takes place, the scenery, the architecture, and the props. The second thing is the lighting, the use of lighting and shadow to establish mood, focus attention, and convey meaning. Yes, that's important. The costumes, the makeup, and the hair, how characters are dressed and presented to reveal personality, how the tourist is presented in the film, how the Caribbean is presented in the film. Yes, the props, the objects in the scene that symbolizes deeper theme, and of course the actor's performance and blocking. Of course, it's a documentary film, but they are there telling the story. Of and the color palette used to evoke emotion. Now, when I talk about mise en scène is simply this: the visual language of a film, the deliberate arrangement of everything you see within the film, within the frame. So, how the film is juxtaposed in the book, I talk about how the film is juxtaposed, how it's pieced together. It shows the tropical beauty is juxtaposed with abject poverty throughout the film. Okay, Stephanie Black, in her opening commentary of the film, intimates that the idea of the film hinged on this ambivalence, which is quite overtly resolved in the film. It is resolved. This ambivalence is resolved in the film. Life and Death blames the neoliberal policies of the global north on the neoliberal policies of the global on Jamaica. In fact, in the opening scenes, a barbed wire fence imposes itself on a picturesque view of lush greenery and pristine terrain, which symbolizes this divide between tourist and vagabond, mobility and immobility. It suggests that the richness of the island is preserved and reserved for the dominant, or those who are dominating, who, through the IMF, impose laws that give as much leeway and freedom of maneuver to the dominated neoliberal imperialists while restricting the decision making powers of the restricted. That's powerful right there. Powerful. Powerful. The immobility. Again, let me say that again. In the opening scene of the film, I don't know if you saw the barbed wire. Did you guys see the barbed wire when the film starts? You see that the barbed wire? You probably didn't think much of it, but that was telling, right? I said in the opening scenes, a barbed wire fence imposes itself on a picturesque view of lush greenery and pristine terrain, which symbolizes this divide between tourist and vagabond. Mobility as against immobility. Those, oh yes, and even today in Jamaica, you see all those, they are buying up all the beaches. Buying up all the beaches. And by the way, I did a podcast called Street Vibe with a Jamaican at the airport. And I don't know if, and I shared it in the class. I don't know how many of you listened to it, and it was quite powerful. Sitting down, talking with this. Of course, she believed that in the 1970s, that part and the 1980s, part of the problem in Jamaica particularly, because she also talked about Haiti, Papa Doc and Papa Doc. He was saying that in the 70s and the 80s, Jamaicans used to go to Haiti to buy and bring it to Jamaica and sell. Of course, things were, and then, but Papa Doc and Baby Doc, the two Haitians, were currying favors from the US, okay, and allowing themselves. So they were terrorizing their people and getting money, but using it for themselves and so on and so forth, which helps to create the problems in Haiti. But she talks about the whole issue of how Edward Seaga and also or the Jamaica Labour Party government also played a role in creating some of the problem, how politics played a role in creating some of the problem. So yes, of course, we talk about that in the film, how politics played a role, but also the IMF and the World Bank played a role. But we talk about the elites, the local people that also greedy people, some greedy people. You create a small set of people who are greedy and share the money to protect certain things, the institutions that's created to maintain control. Yes, but that's quite interesting. Any questions so far? Any? Okay. So that was one of the questions you were asked. And by the way, and if we move on, we talk about dependency. We define dependency. You guys must also understand the issue of globalization. When we talk about globalization, globalization is a process where goods and services cross borders. Globalization is a process where goods and services cross borders. The process of globalization, the process through which goods, services, capital, technology, culture, labor, and information move across borders and connect societies globally. And one of the most important and telling thing about globalization is that you find that capital is about maximizing profit, and it goes wherever it can make the most profit at the least amount of cost. So the Caribbean in the 1960s, 70s, 80s provide a great avenue for that to happen. Okay, which has also deepened the dependency in the Caribbean. In terms of we're going to continue with defining some terms. Anyways, I didn't mean to go into that, but I want to define some terms because I'm going to transition from this and look at the timeline of the Caribbean, and you're going to see how all of this come together. But before we move any further, I want us to first understand a very important concept of spirituality, one, and then I want us to also to understand the issue of resistance. Because I said to you, Life and Death is a film that focuses on resistance, because it tells the true story of globalization. It uncovers the truth about globalization, how it has favored the global north, post-industrial countries, over the former colonized countries. So that's very important to note. So let us continue to define some terms from the last class. So we already defined identity. We already defined dependency, which is a condition in which a nation or people or economy relies heavily on external powers, institutions, or countries for survival, development, trade, capital. And I want to make a point. The more penetratable you are, is the more dependent you are. If you look at the global South and Caribbean countries, the openness of these countries allow for penetration. It's like say for example, when you study power, and for those of us who are into psychology and counseling, the issue of, so if you use the trope of, when you look at the trope of the ability to penetration, the global North wants to ensure they're not easily penetrated. So the less penetratable you are, is the more, so provides a power dynamic in the world. Yes, those who are in control are the ones who are usually doing the penetration. Those who are in control are less penetratable. The idea was always to make the global North, the industrial, the former colonial powers, less penetratable, while the global South countries are penetratable. Say, for example, in order to go to the US and certain countries, you have to jump over hoops. You have to have visas and passport and all that other stuff. In order for the global North to go to the other countries, they make it easier because they want them to come, so that, okay, they want them to come and spend money and so on. Penetration. Then, yes, very important point that we have to consider. So the idea of penetration helps and openness also speaks to the idea of dependency. Okay. Globalization is the process through which goods and services cross border. Jennifer Wenzel, and I explained that in the book in chapter 11, where I talk about globalization. I I explore the fact that the global North is seen as a consumer society, while the global South, in a sense, is a producer society, not a producer society in the sense, in terms of a post-industrial, but the idea was to make the global South a producer society. They produce what is called the commodity chain analysis. The global South produces what the global North consumes. The global South produces what, and if you watch the film Life and Death, they talk about the free zone. The free zone was created as a way for cheap labor and for these countries to produce materials and certain goods that would ultimately go back to the global South. Yes, and so in a sense they were taking advantage of cheap labor, and and that's important for some of these post-industrial countries to maintain their dominance. The part of globalization speaks to the idea of the commodity chain analysis, where the global South produces or makes what the global North consumes. The consumption, the commodity chain analysis. Who is making the commodity for? Yet the production capability remains with the global North. But globalization speaks about the process of where goods and services cross borders. But goods and services weren't supposed to cross borders in the way we think about it. Yes? Goods were supposed to come from the global North into the global South. Life and Death speaks to that. But it wasn't supposed to happen the other way around. Yes, when you watch the film, you see where the local manufacturing sectors were devastated in the global South. Yes, the global South. The North America Free Trade Agreement in the 1990s eviscerated the banana industry in the global south, in the Caribbean. The preferential treatment that the Caribbean had with Europe was wiped away because they created NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, between Mexico, Canada, and the US. And many bananas were made. The Chiquita banana was made in Mexico, which was part of the NAFTA agreement, which was owned by many industrial countries in the US, and so on and so forth. And so they wanted to dominate the market, and they wanted to export to Europe as well. But it's difficult for that to happen when you have Caribbean countries who are benefiting from the preferential banana agreement between Europe or the European Union and the Caribbean, because the European Union wanted to invest in the Caribbean and wanted to provide some advantages to the Caribbean because they were their former colonial countries. And because they are now coming into the international regime, they wanted to give them some leeway to develop and to grow. And once they reach a certain level, then they were really, but that was a problem. And so Bill Clinton and then said that, went to the WTO and to ask them to impose and to prevent this, to stop the policy from happening, which was kind of crazy, which had helped to destroy the banana industry in the Caribbean, because what happened is that NAFTA and the US and Mexico wanted to dominate the banana industry. Yes? And they created restrictions and policies that made it harder. You saw that in the film, that made it hard for goods and services to flow from the global south, from the Caribbean into the global north. But they wanted the Caribbean to open up the economies. Now, you see what's happening today, where Donald Trump is imposing tariffs on any country, and that was in the Jamaica Gleaner about 2 days ago, on countries even in the Caribbean that have a tariff on services. So they want now to be able to dominate the service sector. So there's an imbalance in globalization. There's an imbalance in globalization. Globalization, we said, it is the way goods and services cross border, but yet still, it's difficult for the global south to penetrate or to send goods globally, especially in the post-industrial, when they create rules and mechanisms that makes it difficult for goods and services to flow, and that thwart investments in the local economy. That creates an unfair competition anyways in the first place. Let's look at spirituality. When we look at spirituality, how do we define spirituality? I'm not going to go into this because Reverend Richard Beckford is going to talk about this a little bit. But spirituality, the totality of life, or African spirituality, is the totality of life and the connection of the natural order with human existence and all living beings. African spirituality emphasizes inclusivity, communalism or communism, veneration of the ancestors, harmony with nature, respect for the earth, and the interconnectedness of spirit, community, and life. Now, African spirituality does not separate itself from politics, economics, or daily existence, but was integrated into the whole of life and was part of the African personality. So, if I ask you to define African spirituality is what? It is the totality of life and the connection of the natural order with human existence and all living things. African spirituality emphasizes what? Inclusivity, communalism, veneration of the ancestors, harmony with nature, respect for the earth, and the interconnectedness of spirit, community, and life. And of course, there was no separation between politics and spirituality, economics, and the daily existence of of the African personality. So when you look at the early existence of spirituality among Kemet, people that live in Kemet, that was, well, they call it Egypt or Africa, but it was the earliest name was Kemet. It was called Kemet before the Europeans changed it and call it Kemet. I mean, call it Africa and Egypt. But spirituality and the organization of life was one and the same. You might probably later on in the class you might hear me talk about Asar, Aset, and Heros, which is the same thing as Osiris and Isis, which were the Egyptian god, which forms part of a trinity. The first idea of trinity was the African trinity, which finds its way into Greek mythology and later into Christianity with the Trinity. But of course, there was always Asar, which is the god of the earth, and then Aset, which is the wife of Asar. And of course, Set killed Asar, and she used her magical powers to bring Asar back together. When Asar came came back to life, regenerated, so to speak, he became Horus. And so there comes the first idea of the triad or the trinity, which, of course, in Greek mythology, they learned from or they stole from African spirituality to create their Osiris and their Isis and so on. And then later from that, with Christianity and the Roman and how they Romanize that idea, it became we have a kind of trinity which they believe fed its way into Christianity. It was adopted. The idea, by the way, another idea of spirituality. I see African civilization by now. I'm writing my paper on African civilization, part of my PhD. I talk about the idea of the mat, the ancient Egyptian understanding of the divine was foundational in structuring political systems with rulers or pharaohs often regarded as divine intermediaries. Their governance was built on the principle of Ma'at, which is the goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, which represents balance and harmony. I'm going to talk. I'm going to share a little bit about that, but I won't go into that because this class is not geared towards that. But after Reverend Richard Bedford talks about Caribbean theology, I am going to segue. He's going to probably speak for 2 hours. And in the last 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about the idea of Ma'at. But I want you guys just to understand certain important terms in terms of spirituality. So we're looking at certain terms right now. The next term I want you to understand is how do we define resistance in Caribbean thought? Resistance is the reconceptualization of life and reality by oppressed peoples. Again, it is the reconceptualization of life and reality by oppressed peoples. Resistance involves challenging systems of domination and reclaiming identity, dignity, human culture, spirituality. That's why I defined spirituality just now, because we're talking about Caribbean thought, and we've begun the class 2-3 weeks ago with looking at the Afrocentric paradigm. And when we look at, we're not only are we looking at things from an economic perspective, but from a theological perspective. So part of the way forward, part of our strategy should involve resistance. Resistance which can be strategic. And what is resistance? It is the reconceptualization of life and reality by oppressed peoples. Resistance involves challenging systems of domination and reclaiming identity, reclaiming our identity and our dignity, our humanity, our culture, our spirituality, our land, our labor, and consciousness. Because I said to you in a previous class, the idea of memory is part of identity. Memory is part of identity. And let's go back to the issue of identity. We define identity as the understanding and conception of oneself individually and collectively. Identity is shaped by history, it is shaped by culture, language, spirituality, geography, memory. Now, when we talk, when Africans were enslaved, they were, and power works, and I said to you, colonization is the depersonalization of an individual. It is the stripping away of one's humanity. You strip away somebody's humanity, you are changing their identity. You erase their history, their culture, their language. Not only that, you get rid of any idea, their concept of spirituality. In other words, people from Africa were seen as not having any religion. People weren't people of faith, people that were not spiritual. My first when I did social studies in the Caribbean, my first engagement of history was an understanding in these classes. When we have our social studies class and our history classes, the understanding that we had was that Africans never had any idea of family. If you read Edith Clarke's book, My Mother Who Fathered Me, and Rex Nettleford wrote the preface of that book, My Mother Who Fathered Me. She did a research in some Caribbean islands and Jamaica, and wanted to understand the family dynamics and the family structure in the 1980s, 70s, 80s, 90s of the Caribbean, of certain Caribbean communities. And they were saying that these communities, their practice of family was not aligned with the practice of family in other parts of the Caribbean and in Jamaica that had the nuclear family. She talked about the idea of shacking up and how brothers and sisters and all these people were sleeping with each other and so on and so forth. And they were saying that sociologically speaking, the conclusion was that it was inherited behavior, learned behavior that they carried over from Africa. And in a sense, they looked down on that behavior. And as if they had no concept of family, but that's not true. Because, and Edith Clarke, although she's a Caribbean living in Jamaica, a sociologist, doing research, Christopher talks about the idea of frame in his paper, which was beautiful. What is her frame? I talk about what is C.L.R. James's frame when he wrote the book, The Black Jacobins. And he talks about the book was well-intentioned, the research was well-intentioned, and it's a good book. However, I have some problem with it because he was still speaking within a European-dominated frame. Yes? Because to him, the leader of the Haitian Revolution was Olivier Toussaint. When, from a Haitian perspective, he wasn't necessarily the leader of the revolution. The leader of the revolution was Dessalines and Dottie Boukman. who was a slave from Senegal, who came to Jamaica on a slave ship, escaped from escaped and went to Haiti and helped to develop voodoo and developed resistance against and inspired a revolution, which leading to the Haitian Revolution and their independence. They weren't. These were Africans who were brilliant and smart, who didn't have no engagement with European ideology and training, yet still they were able to galvanize people and defeat the French. But the French did not agree. The French said no. There's no way that these Africans could have done this. It has to be someone who was trained in the French army. Had to be someone who was exposed to European ideology and European thinking, because of course Eurocentrism have a kind of worldview that says this is the only way. Okay, they have to be exposed. So they say yes. So it was Oliver Toussaint who was of mixed race and black, who was trained in the French army, who they said caused the revolution of Haiti. But in Haiti, Haitians said no, not so. It was Dessalines, the African Haitian, and Dottie Boukman, the Senegalese Haitian, who actually led to the revolution. So the frame was wrong, because the African was also trained, was also smart and sophisticated, and they were able to, and they were able, when it took to bring about the revolution. Edith Clark got it wrong, because she was trained in a kind of anthropology and sociology that says African never had any family, African never had any religion, Africa never had any culture. They never had any sense of family, but that's not true. Africans had sense of family and togetherness, but the way the family was arranged is quite interesting and powerful. So, but the issue of identity was important. So I said to you in the last class, colonization involved the stripping away of humanity, shaped by history, culture, language, spirituality, geography, memory, changing any memory that we have of ourselves, getting rid of that, changing our memory and giving a false notion of self. That's important. So when we talk about, so spirituality is very important in our definition, because the African came with a kind of spirituality, not a secondary spirituality. His spirituality wasn't second to the European faith. In fact, what the Europeans did was to steal from our spirituality and bastardized it. They created a bastardized version of spirituality. Yes, that's according to some Afrocentrists or Afrocologists. Yes, a bastardized version of it, of spirituality, in a sense. But the African had an idea of spirituality, and of course, and many Africans who lived in the Caribbean today still was able to hold on to some version of it, because Dottie Boukman came to the Caribbean and was able to continue with that and sell it, and in other words, introduced that spirituality to the Caribbean people, introduced that spirituality and mixed with the indigenous idea of spirituality, which I believe the indigenous people that live in the Caribbean were Africans who were shipwrecked many years ago, who formed a life on the Caribbean islands. But let's move on from the idea of spirituality to resistance. Again, resistance is a reconceptualization of life and reality by oppressed peoples. Reconceptualization. So this class in Caribbean thought, we're reconceptualizing. We're exposing truth. Yes, we're exposing truth. We are reconceptualizing ideas. We're challenging. It involves challenging systems of domination and reclaiming identity, dignity, humanity, culture, spirituality, but also land, labor, and consciousness. Land, labor, and consciousness. I want to read Molefi Asante's book, The Afrocentric Paradigm, in page 8. And on page 8, I love what, on page 8, I love what he says of Amamazama. Page 8, he says, in the end, what the Afrocentric Manifesto intends is to provide the reader with a clear, coherent, and persuasive argument for a reconceptualization of the way Africans view themselves and the way others have viewed Africans. A reconceptualization of the way Africans view themselves and the way others have viewed Africans. I was reading a book. Oh wow, what's the name of that book? W.E.B. Du Bois. Ah, I don't believe it. Do I have that book here? Oh my God. I was reading a book recently and I saw it the other day and I started to read it again. It's about the veil. I probably when we take a break, I will bring it up. And he talks about how we are always thinking about how we view ourselves. Within a veil, do you view yourself as how you think white people view you, or how you think white people view you? Do you think if they view you as closer to them, or as so? It's important for some people to embody and to embrace a kind of language and a kind of identity. The more Don't throw stones at me. I'm just using a concept here. The more you're able to speak the English language, yes, the more cultured you are, the more you're able to assimilate, yes, the more you're able to baptize yourself in a certain way of life, then and become accepted to that way of life, then the more meaningful you are. But if you find another truth outside of that, then you are something else. You are according to Afrocentrists, we are divorcing ourselves from who we really are, from our internal selves. But according to the Molefi Asante, he says that we need to conceptualize the way, as African people, Caribbean people, how we view ourselves. We should not view ourselves as little white people, in a sense. I was reading the book by Homi Baba, The Location of Culture, which is a powerful book. And according to according to Homi Baba, and Homi Baba it's a powerful read, The Location of Culture. Homi Baba talks about, he's from Trinidad and India. And he left and got a Rhodes Scholar to Europe. And, you know, when you get a scholarship to go to an Ivy League college in the US or Oxford, if you get to go to Oxford or Cambridge, it's the highest achievement. It's as if it is the highest achievement in order to go to their schools and get their education. It's the highest achievement. But she quickly, and then when when he got to these schools, he's reading, the hero in the books are not from the Caribbean. They're not black and brown people. They're always white. And so he started to talk about V.S. Naipaul. He found V.S. Naipaul's novels. And in V.S. Naipaul's novels, like V.S. Naipaul's novels, according to Homi Baba, what I found intriguing about Naipaul's novel was the way in which the fiction was capable of being read against the author's intentions. But that's not what I want to. Yeah, that's important. That's important here. His characters, his characters made their way in the world while acknowledging its fragmented structures, its split imperatives, and the prevailing sense of a loss of cultural authority. V.S. Naipaul, and if you guys do Caribbean literature, you will learn about V.S. Naipaul. V.S. Naipaul's book, um, in Naipaul's view, of course, this was nothing more than the fated condition of the Caribbean. History is built around achievement and creation, and nothing was created in the West Indies. And V.S. Naipaul have had a way of bringing to the forefront. He was radical, always talking about the black man or the brown boy, which was kind of weird because before then, the hero and the main characters in major books was from Europe, was from England, was from the US, yes? But in V.S. Naipaul, the dominant characters are from Trinidad, Jamaica, yes? That was powerful. That is resistance. When you start to write and tell the story from your perspective, and when you start to write novels where the hero is the black and brown boy, that is resistance. When Louise Bennett Coverley was doing her poetry and doing it in a language that was Jamaican, in patois, that was her resistance. That is resistance. When you start to baptize and to publicly pronounce and to utilize and to promote your stuff, your language, your image. I was in Jamaica driving through the hoods of Jamaica the other day, and I saw some brown people with black lips, because there are people who are still ambivalent. There's still a level of ambivalence in terms of their identity because we are exposed to certain film and books with, and a certain kind of, and heroes that are white. And so the idea of colorism still exists today, where certain people in certain communities still think that to look good is to be brown and to bleach your skin. To look good and to be accepted, one must speak a certain way. Language is still Spanish, French, and English. Any other language is seen as Creole or patois or broken. Yes, and the more integrated you are in British culture or in French culture or in Spanish culture, is the more you're seen as part, you're assimilated as part of the elite within a certain culture. Yes, the more, in a sense. But when you are able to embrace your language and speak it without apology, when you are able to embrace your black skin and wear it without apology, when you are able to embrace your hair a certain way and wear it without apology in a certain way, that is resistance. We are reconceptualizing life and reality when, as oppressed people, that is a form of resistance. According to Homi Bhabha in the book Location of Culture, which is one of the recommended reading in this class, I hope you guys are reading. The Trinidadian is a cosmopolitan, he writes. He is a natural anarchist who has never been able to take the eminent at their own valuation. He is without the greater corruption of sanctimoniousness, and can never make plea for intolerance in the name of piety. He can never achieve the society approved nastiness of London landlord who turns a dwelling house into a bondage or boarding house, charges exorbitant rents, and is concerned that his tenants live in sin. Everything that makes the Trinidadian an unreliable, exploitable citizen makes him a quick, civilized person whose values are always human ones, whose standards are those of wit and style. What is Homi Baba talking about? The Trinidadian is a cosmopolitan, he writes, a natural anarchist who has never been able to take eminent at their own valuation. He is without the greater corruption of sanctimoniousness. He does not accept the nastiness of of the corruption of being an Englishman or an English woman. Yes? To them, that is nasty. He embraces, like V.S. Naipaul, embraces his culture. He's like Louise Bennett, sees the speaking in a certain way and acting a certain way as nastiness and corrupted. Yes? Quite powerful. Quite powerful. One other thing that I must, in the book, An Afrocentric Paradigm, in page 9, in her book, The Afrocentric Paradigm, Amma Mazama explains that Afrocentricity is not merely a worldview, nor even a theory as such, but rather it is a paradigm that results in the reconceptualization of the social and historical reality of African people. Reconceptualization. Actually, what she suggests is that the Afrocentric paradigm is a revolutionary shift in thinking proposed as a constructural adjustment of Black disorientation, decenteredness, and lack of agency. Quite powerful. Shift in thinking and readjustment. And of course, Fanon writes in Wretched of the Earth that the thing colonized becomes a man through the process of liberation. The thing colonized becomes a man through liberation. And that's powerful. He said, Fanon writes in page 2 of the book, Wretched of the Earth, which is your recommended reading. He says, the colonized man is a political creature in every sense of the term. Is a colonized creature. And so now, in order to decolonize, we have to develop a kind of resistance, yes, that shake our world. And so part of that, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, is to develop a kind of intellectualism, a kind of understanding where we learn the ways that we have been decolonized. We learn the way that we have been oppressed. We learn the strategy. We learn the systems behind colonization, because colonization is a systematic process. So decolonization involves a systematic process. So we have to learn the economics, learn the spiritual ways, and so on and so forth. Another definition that is important in this class that you must learn is, what is nationalism? Nationalism is a doctrine that was invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. The doctrine holds that humanity is naturally divided into nations, that nations possess distinct characteristics that can be identified, and that the only legitimate form of government is national self-government. And of course, if the book, Eli Kaduri's book, Nationalism, chapter 1 speaks about that. Again, the issue of nationalism. Nationalism is really not an African perspective. It's a European ideology. And one of the things that I have said is that the idea of theft, and I said that in the last class, the last class I was lecturing, I was teaching, Nationalism is an important strategy. Africans never had nation states. We had a people, but a practice. We have people that, but not necessarily nations. And they build walls and borders. Um, it was invented by Europe in the beginning of the 19th century. Um, and the issue of nationhood is quite interesting because they, they, they steal land, then create walls, systems, and nations to protect against their theft, to prevent you from, to prevent any attack against what they have done. But, and I have said that nationalism was in the 1960s when Caribbean countries got independence. I don't believe that we should have created independent nations. What should have done was a marriage between the people of the Caribbean, because as new nations, we needed a kind of Caribbean unity to, to mitigate against our vulnerability, our size, um, and what was happening in terms of globalization. Because the fact that we were small, it was easy for penetration to happen in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. It was ironic that in the 1960s, when we got independence, many Caribbean islands got independence. Already, what was brewing was globalization. The world was speeding towards globalization, but globalization that would benefit the global north, the former colonized, the colonizers who were now granting independence. It would benefit them. And the idea of independence, where each country, each Caribbean island was developing nation states, did not suit what was needed in order to maintain their independence. Because if these countries had come together and formed a strong Caribbean community across the board, Cayman and Guadeloupe and Guyana and Barbados and Trinidad and Jamaica. But, all these countries had come together to form an alliance, a larger group of people together. Then they would have been able to stave off the strategy of globalization, which ultimately benefited people of the global north and not necessarily those of the global south. And that is important. We call that's the irony of independence. That's the irony of independence that I spoke about. And in the foreword of the book Wretched of the Earth, it is written that, where was it? I think it was Homi Baba talking about the book Wretched of the Earth in the preface of the book Wretched of the Earth. According to the book, it says, Fanon's two most influential texts, Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth, evoke the concrete and contrasting worlds of colonial racism as experienced in metropolitan France. And that's not where I want to be. Well, yeah, in the 1950s. And during the anti-colonial Algerian War of Liberation, a decade later. In his work, is Frantz Fanon's work lost in a time warp? According to, I think, who is writing this? It is Homi Baba writing in the foreword of the book Wretched of the Earth. And this book, Wretched of the Earth, I'm reading this version was translated from French to English by Richard Philcox, with a commentary by Jean-Paul Sartre and Homi Bhabha. And in the preface or the foreword of the book, Homi Bhabha writes, Fanon, two most influential texts, Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth, evoke the concrete and contrasting worlds of colonial racism as experienced in metropolitan France in the 1950s. And during the anti-colonial Algerian War of Liberation a decade later, which was in the 1960s. And so Homi Bhabha asked, his work, Fanon's work, Black Skin, White Mask, and Wretched of the Earth, his work, is it lost? Are they lost in a time warp? Is his impassioned plea that the third world, and we don't use the word third world anymore. Please remember, we're saying it's global south, but this book was written a long time ago, and it's still written within a European frame, but with good intentions. But I don't use the word third world anymore. I use the word global south. But anyways, is his impassioned plea that, and I should have been using I should have turned on what they call it, closed caption. Somebody can do that. Is his impassioned plea that the third world, quote unquote, must start over a new history of man, merely a vain hope, Does such a lofty idea represent anything more than the lost rhetorical baggage of that daunting quest for a non-aligned post-colonial world inaugurated at the Bandung Conference? In 1955. This is page 9 of the book, Wretched of the Earth. Remember, the Bandung Conference was in 1955, where all the non-aligned countries that were colonies, that were not at the 1944 meeting when the powerful nations met after World War II to develop a world order. Our interests, the non-aligned countries that were colonies, their interests were not represented because they were just colonies. It's the interest, okay? The Bandung Conference met in 1955, and the plan was for them to develop a way forward, was in terms of towards independence. Does such a lofty idea represent anything more than the lost rhetorical baggage of this daunting quest for a non-aligned post-industrial world, inaugurated at the Bandung Conference in 1955? Who can claim that dream now? The dream of that the non-aligned countries came together, where they envisioned freed nations, nation states. But of course, in 1950s, they were talking in the Caribbean. We weren't talking about a kind of nation states that were separate and apart, but a united front. But the idea of nationalism, where everybody have their developed nation, then have their own government, and was able to determine struck their own egos, seemed to be interesting and a good sell. But who can claim that dream now? Who still waits in the antechamber of history? Did Fanon's idea die with the decline and disillusion of the Black Power movement in America? Buried with Steve Biko in South Africa? Or were they born again when the Berlin Wall was dismembered and the new South Africa took its place on the world stage? Questions, questions, questions. But that's not even where I want to read. This is where I want to go from here. He goes on to say, page 11, the colonized, underdeveloped man is today a political creature in the most global sense of the term. Nationalism holds that the humanity is naturally divided in nations, that nations possess distinct characteristics that can be identified, and that the only legitimate form of government is national self-government. Within the Caribbean, nationalism became both a tool of anti-colonial liberation and at times a source of exclusion, fragmentation, and political rivalry. Just let that percolate a bit. Nationalism can be good, but it can also be defeatist, as it was in the 1960s. It wasn't national. The idea of nation states was enticing for those who want to those who want power. All the Caribbean islands, as if they became indoctrinated by colonial ideology. So everybody wants their own power now. So when they're supposed to be thinking about independence and working together to develop to develop a kind of powerful front, they develop individual nations, and the idea of a united front was thwarted, which helped to facilitate their dependency and maintain post-colonial advantages by those of the dominant class, the historical those of the dominant class that had always dominated. So I'm making an important point here. There's one more thing I must, and of course, Eli Kadori is the person that talks about the idea of nationalism as a doctrine invented in Europe at the beginning of the 19th century. It pretends to supply a criterion for the determination of the unit of population, so on and so forth. It holds that humanity is naturally divided into nations, and that nations are known by certain characteristics, which I disagree with that. But that's that's a theory. Okay. There's another. Actually, there is I wanted to go on, but I lost that page that I wanted to share. Um, what is a nation? A body of associates living under one common law and represented by the same legislature. Such a claim is both simple and comprehensive. A nation is a body of people to whom a government is responsible through their legislature. Any body of people associating together and deciding on a scheme for their own government form a nation. And if on this definition, all the people of the world decided on a common government, they would form one nation. Powerful. That's page 7 of Nationalism by Eli Kadori. Now, earlier I was reading, I said to you earlier that in the book Wretched of the Earth, Fanon, Homi Baba is talking about Fanon now. Talking about the idea of the Bandung Conference in 1955. All these non-aligned countries came together. And they came together with one vision, a new history of man, a history of man of that was beyond colonization. And then we go to the next page, and I skipped all the way to the next page, page 11. The colonized, underdeveloped man is today a political creature in the most global sense of the term. So in 1955, the third world, he says the third world must start anew, must start over a new history of man. Is that merely a vain hope? Does such a lofty ideal represent anything more than the lost rhetorical baggage of that daunting quest for an unaligned post-colonial world inaugurated at the Bandung Conference in 1955? Who can claim that dream now? This book was written in the 1960s. Now we push forward. The colonized man, but 1955 we were dreaming of new nations, of new independent free nations that were self-determined, self-governed, that was outside of external control, but yet the colonized, underdeveloped man is today a political creature in the most global sense of the term. In the most global sense of the term. Found on rights in the rest of the earth. And it is my purpose, almost half a century later, to ask what might be saved from Fanon's ethics and politics of decolonization to help us reflect on globalization in our sense of the term. Because here we have the Bandung Conference, here we have the Treaty of Chaguaramas and the Caribbean thinking about that new nation. But now, today, the colonized man is still underdeveloped compared to the rest. He's still a political creature in the most global sense of the term. It must seem ironic, even absurd. I love poetic language, oxymoronic, absurd. The use of language is so powerful, so rich, you know? Anyways, it must seem ironic, even absurd at first, to search for associations and intersections between decolonization and globalization. Decolonization and globalization. We're talking about decolonization to be free of colonization. But at the same time, in the 1955, we're talking about a decolonized world, independent nations and free peoples, while at the same time, in the backward, at the same time, there's globalization. Globalization is where goods and services cross borders. But how does this happen? Goods and services don't cross borders in a vacuum. Yes? Goods and services don't cross borders in a vacuum. And if I have time, we're going to go through the timeline and you will see what is going on in the timeline, or hopefully, I don't know, I think I did put the timeline on the Moodle. So you guys will, and I hope you guys get a chance to look at the timeline and what's going on. This is powerful here. Globalization is where goods and services cross borders, but it doesn't happen willy-nilly. And then the next question is, goods and services are crossing borders, but whose borders? Whose goods and services get to cross unhindered as against others? Where does it flow? Globalization started to take place, especially towards the 1970s, 80s, 90s, in a different kind of a way. So we are dreaming about a free nation, free nations in 1955 and 60s. We are fighting for independence, to be self-determined, have our own government. And then guess what? Oh, yes, we can give you your freedom. Oh, actually, yes, give them their freedom, give them their independence, but make sure it happened on our terms. Don't create an opportunity for them to come together. Give it to them individually. Yes? So that they are not too big to be controlled. And so that globalization can happen in such a way so that, and happen easily, because now because globalization involved the dismantling of borders, getting rid of tariffs, getting rid of unions. Yes? Depreciating the value of your currency. Yes? Not allowing investments in the manufacturing sector to facilitate development. Dismantling trade barriers to allow for goods to cross borders, but your goods can't cross their borders easily, but their goods get to cross your borders. But anyways, the colonized, underdeveloped man is today a political creature in the most global sense of the term. Fanon writes in The Wretched of the Earth, and it is my purpose almost half a century later to ask what might be saved from Fanon's ethics and politics of decolonization to help us reflect on globalization in our sense of the term. It must seem ironic, even absurd at first, to search for associations and intersections between decolonization and globalization. Decolonization and globalization. This is the irony. What is dramatic? You ever see what is, you ever look at, have you ever looked at a film? This is dramatic irony. You're watching a film, you're watching a movie. Let's say it's a horror movie. And you know what is happening in the film, but the characters don't know, right? You you see what's going on in the kitchen. There's somebody waiting in the kitchen with a knife. Okay? Or there was a dopey man in the kitchen. The people in the living room are trying to escape. And they say, where should I go? Should I go to the library? Should I go through the front door? Should I go through the kitchen through the back door? I'm like, no, I'm not going to go through the kitchen. You're watching with a bated breath, with intensity. Yes. This, the picture is zooming in, the mise en scène, everything before the film, the camera is zooming in. What you gonna do? What you gonna do? That's okay. You're watching the film. The character is about to make it to the kitchen to go out to the back door, and you say, no, don't go through the back door. Oh my God. He sees his freedom. Oh, I'm gonna get free. I'm going through the kitchen. And he goes through the kitchen only, but somebody is there waiting on him. That's irony, dramatic irony. Okay, dramatic irony. You see, you the viewers, you see what's going on. You see what's waiting in the kitchen. That's not where the freedom is. But he doesn't really know that. The character in the film, in the screen, he doesn't know that. He doesn't see that. He doesn't see the man in the kitchen or the ghost in the kitchen waiting for him. But for him, his escape is through the back door, but he has to go through the kitchen to get through the back door. That's ironic, right? It is also ironic, the idea of decolonization and globalization, because globalization is that dopey man. Yes? Nationalism, decolonization through nationalism. Decolonization through nationalism does not see globalization. We couldn't see far in the 1950s and 60s. We couldn't see what was going to happen in the 1970s and the 80s. Okay? Little did we know that globalization was going to happen, and it's going to involve what's going to involve. It will involve. Anyways, so so here it is now. It must seem ironic, even absurd at first, to search for associations. That's the irony I talk about when I told you earlier with life and death. The oxymoronic that it speaks in terms of the film, the visual artistry here. Okay, even in the book I talk about in the beginning of the textbook, the preface of the book, I said to you, look at the irony here. Look at the irony. Let's go back now. You see how this is how you follow me now. We're tying it now. When we hear of Jamaica or the Caribbean, we think of beautiful island of paradise with sun, sea, and sand, and blah blah blah. But then I go on to say, in an attempt to escape the adverse realities of inequality and injustice, the people of the global south find themselves in North metropolises with very little agency and minimal change to their lives. There's no escape, because the colonized man is a political creature in the global sense of the term. Wherever he goes, he is despised. The black and brown man is despised. If he starts to make money, that's a problem. They burn down Black Wall Street because Okay, no, no, these black people are making too much money. What's going on with Venezuela? No, 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 no. Venezuela have oil and all of it. What's going on in Guyana? Fine. Oh, Guyana have oil and they think that they have arrived. Absolutely not. So now they create a way in which in Guyana, now Guyana only makes 12% of the oil that they found. Most of the money, 78% goes to the US, comes to the US. They create a way that so because they have not invested in their capital intensive capabilities, so they can't develop the machinery. They now have to go overseas to rely on that, and they supercharge them the cost in order to extract the oil, to refine it, and so on and so forth. Oh, it's a paradise, but yet still we are escaping. That's ironic. Yes, or an oxymoron. But anyways, so here we go again. The colonized, underdeveloped man is today a political creature in the most global sense of the term. It must seem ironic, even absurd. We're taking a break in 2 minutes. We're going to take a 10 minutes break to search for associations and intersections between decolonization and globalization. Parallels would be pushing the analogy. Now, this is the punch. Parallels will be pushing the analogy. When decolonization and the dream of a third world, I hate the word third world, the dream of a global south world, notice I'm going to ask you to define global south. Okay? Global south is not a geographic term, which means countries in this class, or in an economic term, countries that are below to the south of the equator. That is not global south. Okay? Global south is a term that is used to replace the term third world, okay? Because language is powerful and we want to use inclusive language, powerful language that promote the power of the Caribbean and the global south of these countries and these worlds. So we don't use first world and say, oh, the US is first world and then second world and then third world, and because language condition one's thinking. So we don't want to condition a defeatist kind of a thinking. Yes, we want to remember, resistance. The idea of this class is a resistance. Is this class part? The idea of this class is resistance, reconceptualization. So we're not using third world. Don't use third world when you go out there. Don't talk in third world. Global South, the global South countries. Okay, so here we go. Here we go. It must seem ironic, even absurd at first, to search for association and intersection between decolonization and globalization. Parallels would be pushing the analogy. When decolonization had the dream of a third world, that's what he says, quote unquote, of a third world, quote unquote, or a global South world of free post-colonial nations, firmly on its horizon. Whereas globalization gazes at the nation through the back mirror as it speeds toward the strategic denationalization of state sovereignty. The global aspirations of third world or global south national thinking belonged to the internationalist traditions of socialism, Marxism, and humanism, whereas the dominant forces of contemporary globalization tend to subscribe to free market ideas that enshrine ideologies of neoliberal technocratic elitism. And finally, while it was the primary purpose of decolonization to repossess land, again, and finally, while it was the primary purpose of decolonization to repossess land and territoriality in order to ensure the security of national polity and global equity, globalization propagates a world made up of virtual transnational domains and wired communities that live vividly through webs and connectivities online. In what way then can the once colonized woman or man become figures of instruction for our global century? That's powerful. That's powerful. And this class will be available for you guys to watch again because this particular aspect of the lecture is powerful. As we again, I said the global aspirations, the global aspirations of global South national thinking belonged to the internationalist traditions of socialism, Marxism, and humanism. Whereas the dominant forces of contemporary globalization tend to subscribe to free market ideology, enshrined in ideologies of neoliberal technocrat elitism. And I'm going to make this point that when decolonization had the dream of a global world, global South world of free post-colonial nations firmly on its horizon, the mission and vision of the formerly colonized countries. What we had on the horizon was post-colonial nations. Globalization at the same time gazes at the nation through the back mirror because globalization promotes elitism. Yes, it promotes free market. So we're thinking about free nations, while at the same time globalization is about to happen and it promotes free market. So then, and the forces of globalization is external to the ideals of nations. But to what nations? To the new nations that just got their independence. Because where are we starting from? What was necessary for the independence, for the power, is that these countries were to come together and formulate an alliance instead of splitting up their countries in small polities that allows for domination. Before we take the break quickly, let me define sovereignty. Sovereignty is the authority and ability of a people or nation to govern itself independently without external domination or interference. Again, what is sovereignty? It is the authority and the ability of a people or a nation to govern itself independently without external domination or interference. Now, remember, the globalization involved this free market. Yes, the dismantling of borders to allow for free trade and so on and so forth. Um, and then, okay, so how does sovereignty challenge the ideals of nation, formerly independent, of nation states like Jamaica and other Caribbean that got their independence in the 1960s? How does that affect their sovereignty? Sovereignty includes political, economic, territorial, cultural, and intellectual control over one's affairs. In the Caribbean context, sovereignty remains contested as many nations continue to experience economic dependency. We talked about dependency earlier. Foreign political influence, debt control, military intervention. And if you read the book Caribbean Reader by Norman Gervin and Ian Weeks, I think it is, that's in your in the syllabus. Notice I'm gonna be referencing a lot of the books because by this week I expect you guys to be reading. So I hope you guys are reading. If you read the introduction, the first couple chapters of the Caribbean Reader, and you don't have to buy the book. I put the link, you copied it and paste the link into your URL. The entire book comes up there. And the first couple of pages is telling because the first couple of pages started with a vision of Maurice Bishop revolution in Grenada. and the People Revolutionary Army of Grenada, and how he was assassinated by his very own people that influenced by the CIA and the US. Okay. That's the picture, the first picture of it, because people want, you know, people are enticed by what they can get. They're willing to sell their souls in order to create dependencies. But anyways, in the context of the Caribbean, sovereignty remains contested as many nations continue to experience economic dependency, foreign political influence, debt control, military intervention is another way that um, former colonized, I mean, sorry, the dominant the dominant countries, powerful countries, this especially the US, and even now you have countries like Russia that is flexing its muscle over a former colony, which got their independence in the 1980s following the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the breakup of the Soviet Union. Um, uh, Now, obviously, when they got independence, they said we didn't really give them independence. We only give them an opportunity to manage their own affairs. But um, insofar as they are doing things outside of what we want them to do, then we will intervene. And so here it is that Russia has intervened because they believe that Ukraine is allowing, is growing, and they are also trading with foreign partners. And now they are becoming powerful. Now they are becoming part of the United Nations, or there are talks about them becoming part of the United Nations. That is off the table. And so now they're using military intervention. Yes, they are to upend that. Of course, with Haiti in 1825, it was the imposition of debt. In the Caribbean, we see the is tying conditions to aid and to loans, to which ultimately create debt, and charging exorbitant interest rates that creates debt. um, with Cuba and Grenada, with Venezuela, you see the military. With Cuba and parts of Jamaica, the CIA, especially in the 1980s and 90s, the CIA was on the ground. And globalization, despite former political independence. Um, I'm going to move on to that. I think we're going to stop here and we're going to take a break. When we come back from the break, you're going to come back at 9. I'm going to give you a 10 minutes break. So we will come back around 9:17. All right.
8:17 local time.
Sorry, 8:17. And when we come back, we're going to look at the timeline. All right. But just before we actually, we'll come back at 9:15. So we'll come back at 9:15. Oh no, sorry. Yeah, 8:18. 8:20. Come back at 8:20. Because there's one more thing. I already said that I'm not gonna talk about this actually. The lecture rejects the idea of Caribbean history, beginning with Columbus. We're gonna see that on the timeline. Okay, so now we're at the timeline. Okay, so we're actually at the timeline now. So when we come back, we talk about the timeline. So yeah, we can take a break now. The Caribbean as paradise and crisis, the Caribbean government. Oh, okay, now I'm just so you know that this particular lecture is a continuation from a previous lecture. There are some questions that we are asking ourselves in this lecture. What is the Caribbean? Who determines Caribbean identity? Why do many Caribbean nations remain economically dependent after political independence? What role did colonialism, slavery, debt, and globalization play in shaping the Caribbean? Is Caribbean truly independent? Is Caribbean independence truly complete? How do Caribbean thinkers challenge Eurocentric history and the knowledge systems? What will the Caribbean be today and tomorrow? So those are some key questions at the end of this lecture. Then you should be able to answer those questions. Okay, we have defined some key terms. We've watched the film Life and Death. Um, okay, so now when we come back from the break at 9:20, we're gonna go into the timeline. All right. So you're officially on a break. We come back at 9:20.
Know that.
All right. Right. China and modern Caribbean geopolitics. China, the United States, and modern geopolitics. If Iran had a nuclear weapon, would the US and Israel attack? Second, think about it. Do Jamaican, sorry about the spelling is incorrect. I don't have time to correct it right now, I'll correct it later, but do Jamaican and other Caribbean countries face challenges to Chinese aid and development from China and or the US? Do Jamaicans and other Caribbean countries face challenges to Chinese aid and development from China and or the USA? I mean, of course, powerful countries benefit from cheap labor and so on, so they want some countries to remain poor so that they can benefit from cheap labor. They do. It is within the interest of some countries for other countries not to be developed. Yes, or capital. That is the interest of capital. What if Jamaica became more question? What if Jamaica became more developed and start producing wealth? Would that create competitive challenges for the US? And how might they respond? Now that that's powerful. Let me ask it again. What if Jamaica became more developed? Jamaica and the Caribbean. I shouldn't say I forget it's not Jamaica thought, it's Caribbean thought. What if Jamaica and the Caribbean? But we're in Jamaica doing this course. Um, what if Jamaica and by extension the Caribbean became more developed and start producing wealth? Would that create competitive challenges for the US and how might they respond? And not just the US. The US, well, I mean, the Caribbean is the Caribbean is in the Americas. So the dominant nation, the superpower within our region is the US. Okay. So we're going to always talk about, so the US is the dominant country. We were colonized by, well, Britain, Spain, France, but most of the elites who in the US wanted to control the wealth in the US, and by virtue they got their independence, but the milieu, the colonist ideology continues. Anyways, the last question. Today, China's investment in the Caribbean are increasingly being challenged by the United States, particularly under Donald Trump, who does not want China to become too influential in the region. Yet China has contributed significantly. Oh, sorry, this is not a question. Yet China has contributed significantly to modernizing Caribbean infrastructure. The danger, however, is that the Caribbean may become modernized while simultaneously becoming more dependent. Well, I mean, it may become more modernized, it may become also independent. It may become dependent on China, but not necessarily. I should have said it may become more modernized and independent. And independent. So it shouldn't be dependent. It may become more modernized and more dependent. So independent. Or I should say it may simultaneously become less dependent. Okay, so we could take out more and put less dependent. Less dependent. And that is not necessarily the goal of the international regime, which seeks control rather than autonomous transformation. Controlled, which seeks seeks for controlled development rather than autonomous transformation. That is important to think about. And probably that's something, I don't know if Jamaica is discussing that right now. Jamaica seems to be doing, I was speaking with my brother, some of my brothers, and they're saying, Jamaica, and I have some friends in Jamaica that I visited. Some of them have businesses in Jamaica, Some of my young friends who, when I left Jamaica and stuff, now some of them are businesses. And they say, there's money in Jamaica, there's money in Jamaica, Ronaldo. There's money in Jamaica, man. I mean, how long is that? I mean, how long is that are we gonna always have money in Jamaica? Is it gonna be short-lived? Are we gonna suffer the ire of the Americans? Because now they're charging all these tariffs. They're even charging tariffs on remittances, you know. Um, that's something to think about. But you guys can think about that as we proceed for this section of the class. I wanted before we look at the timeline, there is one thing I need to talk about: colonialism and dependency. Colonialism, of course, we know, transformed the Caribbean into plantation economies dependent on Europe and later the US. Even after independence, many Caribbean nations inherited colonial institutions, foreign economic dependency, debt, and unequal trade systems. Unequal trade systems. Neoliberal globalization argues that colonialism evolved into modern economic dependency through the IMF, structural adjustment. I hate, the grammar. Anyways, IMF, structural adjustment, foreign investment, tourism, dependency, multinational corporations, um, and debt. I'm not going to read that. I'm just listing it for you guys. I'm not going to go into it right now because I've been talking about this in general. Again, colonialism transformed colonialism transformed the Caribbean into plantation economies dependent on Europe and later the United States. Very important to note. I'm trying to bring up a, oh wow, where is it? Oh, here we go. Um, let's see if there's anything else I need to talk about here. Um, right, colonialism and dependency. Now, of course, Caribbean dependency is partly strategic. It's partly strategic, created through a historical process stretching from Columbus until now. Even in light of political independence, the Caribbean remains dependent, and in many ways, its dependence was gifted. Um, it's our our independence was gifted. The Caribbean independence was gifted. It inherited institutions, systems, and structures that continue to preserve dependency today. Of course, this conclusion emerges from critical thinking, thinking about thinking, and of course, critical thinking is thinking about thinking and uh, and thinking about what was previously thought. Um, Michel Foucault, um, the post-structuralist thinker, highlights how institutions are created to maintain forms of knowledge that preserve the status quo. And I mentioned him earlier. Of course, that is so the knowledge that we have in society today, the knowledge base that we have is important. It's of course, and we inherit some systems. So say for so of course part of the conversation we need to have is to revisit our institutions. Look at the institutions that we have today. Um, and of course, Michel Foucault um, was was born in France. The powerful guy. He died in June 25, 1984. And of course, he's a critical thinker. Um, of course, I think many people think that he was a Marxist. Okay. And at some point, I believe I was a Marxist and maybe still am a Marxist. Okay. But but of course, he was a philosopher, and he was critical of Western ideology. And of course, eh, part of his thinking, he was a structuralist and a postmodernist. And of course, his theories really address the relationship between power, knowledge, and liberty, and he analyzed how they are used as forms of social control through multiple institutions. Um, and of course, he rejected certain labels, but he he was quite powerful. And of course, his work influenced anthropology and communication. But um, and that's important. I think that's the idea that Frantz Fanon was trying to push home here. He says, how can we envision new nations without revisiting our institutions? How can we promote liberty without revisiting our institutions? If Michel Foucault is right, um, where of course, Fanon argued that we must begin a new history of man, yet perhaps we do not have to begin a completely new history because we already have civilizations and experiences from which we can learn. African people, indigenous Americans lived communally and did not divorce life from the spirit. Um, they embraced community. Of course, African life was communal. European life is competitive. Competitive. Um, Homie Baba said that the Trinidadian is a cosmopolitan, but is also an anarchist. Yes, who will not accept the nastiness of London, who will not attempt to be sanctimonious while cruel. That's what Homie Baba said. Homie Baba himself was once convinced that going to England on a Rhodes Scholarship represented the height of achievement for the Indian or the Trinidadian intellectual. Yet later he hailed V.S. Naipaul as a genius because Naipaul drives home, Naipaul drove home the center from the periphery in the location of culture, highlighting that theories of Naipaul are often the unlikely characters we see. So we do not have to, according to V.S. Naipaul, sorry, Homi Baba, we do not have to see the Great Walls of London physically because they exist within our world and within our time. That's a powerful statement from Homi Baba when referencing V.S. Naipaul. We do not need to see the Great Walls of London because they exist within our world and within our time. We don't have to want to go elsewhere. We can see them here and create opportunities to make them elaborate. Okay. And of course, as I said to you earlier, he despised the Bandung Conference. He thought it was defeatist. Okay. Um, he thought it was defeatist. Anyways, we're gonna go to look at next. I want to now turn our attention to the timeline. Did you guys have a copy? I'm gonna probably stop this here. By the way, one of the questions you may ask here is Haiti. We're gonna talk about Haiti. Is Haiti really independent, and why does DR have two independence? You'll notice that. Of course, Haiti's independence was in 1804, and it did not merely free the western side of Hispaniola; it shook the entire colonial world. Okay, so and of course, the meaning of independence on the island became contested. So Haiti's victory over France represented the first successful Black republic. But France and other colonial powers refused to legitimize and to embrace their freedom and to embrace them as part of the modern world. So, and of course, in 1825, France forced Haiti to pay a massive indemnity in exchange for recognition, turning liberation into debt, of course. All right. And so therefore, you have to ask the question, was Haiti really free? So that's quite interesting. Was Haiti really free? So we're going to turn our attention to the timeline. I'm going to exit this, stop sharing my screen, and then we are going to go to, I'm going to bring up the timeline of the Caribbean. Where is it? Here we go. Is this it? Oops. Yeah, timeline of the Caribbean. Wait, go back to Zoom. Now, did you guys have a copy of the timeline of the Caribbean? Did you guys see a copy of it? I think I circulated it. O'Neill, did we send them a copy of the timeline of the Caribbean? Timeline of the Caribbean, of Caribbean history. Did you guys see a copy, get a copy of that?
Sir, it's on Moodle or was it sent via email?
I think it's on Moodle as well.
Yes, sir.
Okay, sir, let me check.
Somebody said yes. Somebody said yes, they saw it.
Yes, sir. It's on.
You did?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the timeline of the Caribbean. Of course, I'm just gonna quickly peruse it. Of course, we start with I begin my timeline of of Caribbean history with the time of Kemet, 5,000 years ago. Kemet was the ancient African civilization and the name associated with Black Africa, including Egypt. So Egypt, FYI, was never Egypt. The name Egypt was given to Egypt by the colonizers from Britain, from Europe. Egypt was always known as Kemet. It was part of Kemet, the land of Kemet. Africa was part of Kemet. So just so you know. All right. Do you understand that, guys? Um, Kemet introduced advanced systems of mathematics, writing, sailing, navigation, medicine, architecture, and spirituality. Spiritual systems included ancestor veneration, the worship of Asa and Aset, A-U. The spelling is incorrect. Well, I mean, actually, it's not incorrect. Some people spell it like that. I'm gonna let it stay. Asa and Aset. Some people spell it like this. Asa and Aset. And I'm gonna put this in inverted in comma so that you guys Asa and Aset. It's very important. And practices later echoed in Santeria, Obia, Voodoo, and even evidence of Islamic influence. Um, Earlier I showed, and probably have to go back. Go? Are you seeing that the PowerPoint? Earlier in the PowerPoint, I had um, okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to share it again so that you guys see the poll. Did you guys see the PowerPoint I just had up? Let me know if you're seeing it now. Okay. Um, this PowerPoint, I talk about rationalizing African presence in the Caribbean. Africa was civilized and sophisticated. We said that Africa was civilized and sophisticated. Um, I start from Kemet because I want to show how um, the how European people like Columbus and the Portuguese learned from the Africans, in fact, and how they knew about the Caribbean before Europe knew about the Caribbean and the East Indies and the West Indies. Africa was trading with the East Indies and to, they were actively traveling. The travel existed between the Caribbean or Americas and Africa before Europe got there. Um, they were civilized and they were sophisticated. They were skilled shipbuilders. And let's look at this African ship in the Caribbean. Um, in the book, they came before Columbus. This was taken from the book. They came before Columbus. Um, you can see those ships are African ships. Just so you know, those were African ships, and sometimes they had African sailors. Columbus had Africans with him to help him with navigation and with the and so on and so forth. But um, there was the East African trading ship. Actually, so the ship on the upper left of the screen that's the East African trading ship. It's a ship of great antiquity. It sailed the Indian Ocean between Africa and China, and is held together not by nails but by palm fiber lacings. And of course, these ships could be as large as 70 tons. The one shown here, of course, is from a model of the Fort Jesus Museum at Mombasa. The Swahili transshipped an elephant to China in the 13th century. Okay. In the bottom left of your screen, that is shows an African power canoe, and it's an artist impression, of course. And it's a type of boat which is encountered on the Gambia, which is encountered on the Gambia by Portuguese explorer Alvise da Cados Mosto in 1455. Similar boat with a 48-man crew developed on the Orinoco by South American Indians. So South American Indians in 120 AD had a similar boat. Of course, that boat is it's an African canoe, okay? That also, where this was also the American Indians also had a canoe like that, like this. It shows how. That's why I'm saying the Africans were coming to, some people are so close-minded. Some people are so narrow. Once you learn something, you latch onto that thing and don't see anything else. I refuse to think that we are just American Indians. We are African, but we are also Indians. I believe that Indians, um, uh, the American Indians, some of them are Africans. Many of them African came to the New World, not as slaves, but as sailors, as explorers. Many of them formed life in the Americas. So the people we call indigenous people in the Americas, many of them were Africans who sailed from Africa and made a life there, because you know what? Look at the resemblance of these people. Some of these people are Indians who have African facial features and traditions. If you notice, a lot of the artifacts and the stuff, they look alike. There's some similarity between American Indians and how we worship and our facial features and some of our cultures and stuff. There's a lot of similarity. They said that Santiri is an American Indian tradition, but it's also aspects of African spirituality is contained in Santiri, almost like voodoo and obia and so on. With the ancestral veneration, there's some similarity there, which I strongly believe that Africans were sailing to the Caribbean, and many of them form a life here in the Caribbean, but they weren't competitive. They didn't come here and form nation states and said, oh, we discovered it. They formed a life, and they were willing to share what they learned with others. Okay, so they were willing to share. There were people who share because that's their faith, that's their spirit. They are not competitive. Europeans are competitive. Even in their religion, they're competitive. Okay, if you don't worship my God, then you're not worshiping at all. But in Africa, they were willing to accommodate other faith experiences because their traditions and their culture wasn't competitive. But within Europe, they are competitive, and even within their religion, it is competitive. But anyways, so the bot, so of course, so this ship, this canoe at the bottom was also found to be in South America, South American Indians. And of course, they sailed from Venezuela to Puerto Rico. So there was a lot of travel between Puerto Rico. The Indians were the South American, the Americans, Americas had, that was traveling actively. That's why I'm saying to you, some of us here, we are descendants, not necessarily from slaves, or sorry, people who were enslaved that was brought here after the transatlantic, but we may also be related to people who were not brought here, who were already here from when Africans were sailing to the Caribbean and India and China, because many of them were going to, the Europeans were going to China, having conversations, talking with the Africans, trading with them, learning about East India and West India, the West Indies and the East Indies. And they sailed to, according to the story, Columbus buck up on the West Indies. He didn't buck up on no West Indies. He learned about the West Indies. He wanted to go to the East Indies, but came to the West Indies, and it just appeared out of nowhere. No, they learned about it from people. They were already coming here and they were having conversations with the Africans. Anyways, this on the bottom left. The speed was sustainable. This speed. Well, it says that they traveled from Venezuela to Puerto Rico in 1 day. In 1 day. Average speed was 8 knots, an hour in storm-free seasons. This speed was sustainable night and day since oarsmen would work in shifts, 24 resting, 24 rowing. Note, waterproof awnings for provisions. So this is quite interesting. Now on the right side, it shows on the right side, it shows the ship. It's called Ra 1. It was built by African boatmen. African boatmen from Lake Chad built this papyrus boat along with the pattern of the ancient Egyptians, or of course, Ivan Van Sertima was also not writing within a Afrocentric frame, so he should have said instead of ancient Egyptians, he should have said from the Commissions. Commissions, that's what they were called, the Commissions. It left North Africa in 1969 and sailed as far as Barbados. Far as Barbados. So there was active travel happening. And this is quite powerful. Quite powerful. Let's go back to the timeline. So go back to share. Where's share my screen? I lost it. Oh, here we go. Go back to the timeline of the Caribbean. Share. So it's important to start with that timeline, showing that Kemet was the ancient African civilization named with Black Africa, including Egypt. Kemet introduced advanced systems of maths, writing, sailing. So it's navigation, medicine, architecture, spirituality. Spiritual systems included ancestor veneration, the worship of Asar and the Set, and practices later echoed in Santeria, Obeah, Voodoo, and even the evidence of Islamic influence. So now So it's important. That's why we start. So you see the time of Kim, and this is an important reference point here. So now that our timeline begins there, and then we go to before Columbus. Of course, those pictures I showed you came from they came for Columbus. The African presence in ancient America, it's not far-fetched to think that they were there because they were mathematicians and sailors and had developed systems and equipment that would take them far and wide. So of course, African presence in the Caribbean, African traders and sailors were present in the Caribbean prior to Columbus. Africans from the region such as Guinea and Sierra Leone traded gold, spears, handkerchiefs, language, and spiritual practices and culture with indigenous peoples of the Americas. And many of the indigenous people were even Africans who came to form a life in the Americas. Um, I hope you guys are finding this interesting as I am. Um, You guys are not getting this anywhere in the Caribbean. You guys are getting this. Okay? This is powerful, just so you know. Some of this is doctoral level work, but it's a timeline. It's a timeline. I'm showing you. We can't do Caribbean thought and talk about Caribbean history without showing a timeline. Okay? Before African traders and sailors were present in the Caribbean. Now, okay, I said that already. Uh, where am I? Where am I? Where am I? Empire. Africans from regions such as Guinea and Sierra Leone traded gold, spirits, handkerchief, language, spiritual practices, culture with indigenous people of the Americas, the Caribbean. Okay. Actually, I need to read something for you that speaks to that quickly. Well, we're gonna wrap up soon. Here we go. I'm reading from page 16 of the book They Came Before Columbus. Columbus ended up on a branch of the North Equatorial Current, which took him initially to a Caribbean island with three great rocks, which made him think of the Holy Trinity. He named the island Trinidad. A little more to the south, however, he did come in sight of the South American mainland, August 1, 1498. Columbus, for some odd reason, would not land. On this third voyage, he came upon more evidence of the contact between Guinea and the New World. From a settlement along the South American coast, on which his men landed on Tuesday, August 7, the natives brought handkerchiefs of cotton, very symmetrically woven and worked in colors like those brought from Guinea, from the rivers of Sierra Leone, and of no difference. Not only were they alike in style and color, but also in function. These handkerchiefs, he said, resembled amazars, Guinea headdresses, and loin cloths. Each one is a cloth so woven in colors that it appeared an almazar, with one tied on the head and the other covering the rest. The other covering the rest, of course. I'm reading from hold on. Reading from this. They came before Columbus. These were the earliest documented traces of the African presence within the first and second decades of the so-called discovery. African settlements and artifacts were to be cited by the Spanish. African settlements. Africans were settling in the Caribbean way before Columbus. So we talk about Maroons. I said to you the other day, many of these Maroons that they saw Many of these people that they saw in in the Caribbean, um, some of them were African settlers. Okay, so by the time, and of course, many people believe that Ferdinand poisoned and killed Columbus because they did not. He, if you read on, he did not want people to know of this, so they got rid of Columbus. Okay, they got rid of Columbus. He died soon after. But it's quite interesting that they were African settlers. Now, when by 1655, when the British came, Columbus didn't. It is thought that they created a genocide, but not necessarily so. It's important for them to create that narrative, okay, to create that narrative. But many of the indigenous people remained in the Caribbean and had settlements and commune all over the Caribbean. There was active travel happening all over the Caribbean. When the British came in 1655, many of the Spanish people left. They said they freed the Africans and they went to the mountains. Ridiculous. They were settlers all over. Okay. By the time the Spanish came, what happened? These people went, they know the land too well. They went to the mountains and so on and so forth. There was no transatlantic. Okay. Slaves weren't coming here. They were coming here as free people, as intelligent people, setting up life here and community here. So the people that we call Maroons weren't necessarily, some of them were indigenous people, and so were indigenous people that were already coming here. That were already here. That by the time the Spanish people left, they left, but who remained were the people that were already here, who already know the land, who had a deep connection to the land, that we call Maroons, as if these people were marooned. No, some of these people are indigenous people. Anyways, if you continue looking at the parts of the Caribbean, anything else I need to read here? These were the earliest documented traces of African presence. African settlements and artifacts were to be cited by the Spanish when they were not reported as mere asides. They were ignored or suppressed. They were ignored. It was not in their interest to speak of these settlements, because if you can't say you discover something and claim it, and at the same time saying that you see Africans here and see other people here, it's not within their interest. So they suppress the information, okay, so that they can maintain the lie. But history is not easily buried. In the oral traditions of the Native Americans and the Guinea Africans, in the footnotes of the Spanish and Portuguese documents, part of the story lies. Another part lies embalmed under the American and African earth. As this earth is now being lifted by archaeological picks and trowels, a new skeleton emerges of the history of these adjacent worlds. So when you start to dig up these old people, these skeletons and stuff, you find these people looking like this. In the Americas, African people, skeletons thousands of years, hundreds of years old. What are African skeletons and doing in the Americans? They were already here, settling here. We talk about American Indians. American Indians are Africans who came here as free people and settled in the Caribbean. Now, of course, I would have your professor will have a fierce debate with the Urban Indian Heritage Society. I mean, of course, yes, they promote Indian heritage and see that Indian heritage, but the Indians were African. Some of them were free and some of them were not, came here as slaves. The Indians that we call Indians are Africans who came and found this land and formed and settled here. Maybe there were Indians here and they curry favor, but quite interesting, quite powerful. I'm a little bit on the side with some of what I hear, but anyways, I'm going to wrap up this lecture because next week we're not going to do the timeline. Give me 5 more minutes and we're done. Let me just quickly go through the timeline. Anything else I need to say here about the timeline? Go back here, go back here. Okay. Then the next one is the next time period is 1492 to 1493, the reinvention of the Caribbean within the New World. I call it the reinvention of the Caribbean within the New World. So Columbus represented the reinvention of the Caribbean within the New World. Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, bringing European religion, conquest, and imperial ambitions. Bringing religion, conquest, and imperial religions. Bringing European religion, conquest, and imperial ambitions. His motives included gold, profit, greed, land acquisition, and European competition for capital accumulation and empire building to extend the empire. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, guys, there was a faith here. Then, of course, from the 1500s to the 1800s now is the transatlantic slave trade, which is also this is the time when people start talking about racism. Okay, race as a ideology was a theory, just so you know. We never think in terms of race. Not until they were about to enslave a whole set of Africans and call them second class people or property. That's when they moved theory from the back shelves of academia to the front, baptized it and blessed it, and said, yes, it exists. There are some people that's more important than others. Okay? But the 1500s to the 1800s was the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Caribbean to labor on sugar plantations, transforming the Caribbean into a plantation society built on enslavement and extraction and racial capitalism. The 1600s to the 1700s, the rise of Maroons and resistance, resistance movements throughout the Caribbean, escaped Africans, formed independent communities. Now, I changed it. I thought I did. The rise of Maroons, blah, blah, blah. Escaped Africans, formed independent communities, and resisted colonial domination. But, okay, fine. But they were indigenous people, not just escaped Africans. But some of them were escaped Africans, formed in the. It's supposed to be escaped Africans and indigenous peoples. Why would I say that? It's escaped Africans and indigenous peoples. Formed independent communities and resisted colonial domination. 1760s to 1780s, Dottie Bookman was brought from Senegambia to Jamaica. It's very important that I highlight his timeline because he's very instrumental in the Haitian Revolution. So from the 1760s, 1780, Dottie Bookman was brought from Senegambia, that's Gambia and Senegal, to Jamaica. Okay, so some Jamaicans are from Senegal, some of them are from Gambia, but they're from Africa. Africa wasn't really separate apart. They were really a people, the Commissions. 1791, Dottie Bookman escaped to Haiti, became a voodoo priest, and helped organize the first major revolt of the Haitian Revolution on August 14, 1791. At Boy Carmon, he was killed later that year. Now, Dottie Bookman, knowledge in Islam, Obi, and Voodoo represented the highly spiritual and dynamic religious systems Africans brought with them to the Caribbean. His influence, that they brought with them to, of course, his influence helped inspire the Haitian Revolution and leaders such as Toussaint Louverture. 1791 to 1804, the Haitian Revolution resulted in the defeat of France and the establishment of Haiti as the first Black Republic in 1804. Of course, then 1804, the Africans in Haiti defeated the French and secured freedom. Dessalines and Bookman were recognized by many as heroes of the revolution. while Europeans often elevated Toussaint as the acceptable face of the revolution. In Haiti, the face of the revolution was Dessalines and Boukman. Now, why is it that we learn in the book, when you read books and so on, you hear about Toussaint Louverture? But we mentioned this earlier. I mentioned why. He was trained in the French military. I think he was mixed. I think he was married to a French as well. So they said there's no way that these black people can arrange, and we're not going to undo this themselves. Somebody have to be of French ancestry and heritage. And okay. Anyways, 1807, the British Parliament abolished the transatlantic slave trade. 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, legally abolishing slavery throughout most of the British Empire, including the British West Indies. Now, just so you know that in 1833, when slavery was abolished, people in the Caribbean were still working as slaves. They didn't know that they were free. Parliament freed them, but they were still working, not knowing that they were free until until 1865. Until 1865. That means if they never were supposed to get any money because they were once seen as property. If they were freed in 1833 and was working from 1833 to 1865, why is it that the British Parliament today has not recognized that and provide a reparation between those years when black people were working on the plantations when they were freed? And okay. February 27, 1844, the first Dominican Republic independence. You're going to notice something. I have first Dominican Republic and second Dominican Republic independence. You're going to notice that. And I'll play a video next week about that. After Haitian rule over Eastern Hispaniola from 1822 to 1844, Dominican nationalists such as Juan Pablo Duarte, Francisco del Rosario Sanchez, and Martínez, they declared independence from Haiti and favored and aligned with the Spanish. Okay, and in a sense, the Spanish recolonized them in a sense. Of course, these locals wanted their own. They wanted to dominate. They didn't want to have anything to do with Haiti, and they wanted power for themselves. And so they realigned themselves with the Spanish and drove out the Haitians. And of course, Haiti went back to Spanish control because of these three people who tried to make it seem as if Haiti had colonized them when Haiti didn't really colonize them. What they did was free the entire island from European domination. But these people who wanted to get benefits and were power hungry made it seem as though Haiti was ruled by Haiti. That part of Hispaniola which is the Dominican side, was ruled by Haiti, and they were nationalists. That's why I said that sometimes nationalism is good. Nationalism is good, but it can be bad. And so they separated themselves from Haiti and went to Spain, and and of course got Spain to help them to overthrow the Haitians out of Hispaniola, which ultimately mean that that Dominican became a colony of Spain under the rulership of Juan Pablo, who was Dominican but a nationalist, but he was power hungry. Okay. That's February 27, 1844. That's when that happened. In 1848, the abolition of slavery in the French Caribbean colonies. In 1848, in 1850s, Great Revival. No, this is important. In 1850, the Great Revivalism and Jamaican Revivalism emerged as a major spiritual movement, emphasizing African retention, spirit, possession, renewal, and resistance. So there was a great revivalism, the Great Revivalism, and the Jamaican Revivalism, which also includes a lot of African traditions or African spirituality with some amount of Christianity mixed in. Um, the Pocomania, Poco was a big thing in those times. That is the rise of the Poco Church. And of course, Jamaican Revival Church. And revivalism also involves the practice of Pocomania and Obia as well. But the Great Revivalism and Jamaican Revivalism emerged as a major spiritual movement, a reaction emphasizing African retention, spirit possession, renewal, and resistance from domination. November 6, 1865 was the second Dominican Republic independence following annexation by Spain in 1861. Dominican nationalists led by Gregorio Luperon fought the Restoration War and successfully restored Dominican sovereignty in 1865. So in 1844, Spanish one Pablo Duarte and his friends, nationalist friends, went to the Spanish to get them to help to overthrow the Haitians but Haitians didn't really colonize them. What they did was they freed the whole of Hispaniola from European control, but these power-hungry, greedy locals wanted control and wanted to separate themselves from Haiti, the land, I mean, from and that part of the land. And so they went to Haiti to Spain. And now it ultimately really caused Europe to repossess that part of Hispaniola. So in 1865, um, by 1865, following annexation by Spain in 1861, Dominican nationalists led by Gregorio fought the Restoration, the war, and successfully restored Dominican sovereignty in 1865. Finally, I'm going to invite here now. Official of notification of emancipation reached part of British West Indies in 1865. I said that earlier, 1865. That's just when the notification for emancipation reached part of the British West Indies, marking the formal transition from slavery to legal freedom for formerly enslaved Africans. And of course, in 1873, the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico and Spanish Caribbean. I'm going to stop here. When we come back, we will class next week. We'll pick up from here. We'll continue to review the timeline of the Caribbean. This is my final. Yes, Lisa, go ahead.
Yes, sir. Question. So in the 1850s, it says that Great Revivalism and Jamaica Revivalism emerged as
Yeah.
major spiritual movements emphasizing African retention, spirit possession, renewal, and resistance. Now, has it ever changed to Christianity over the years?
I mean, we've always had Christianity. When Columbus came, he said he came to bring religion. He was also seen as a missionary, yes, but he said he helped to Christianize the Africans because the Africans never had religion. So they brought Christianity, they brought European culture. So the advent of the Europe in the Caribbean was the advent of Christianity. Part of colonization involves and extending Europe control was also extending the power of the church, the Catholic Church, and then the British brought Anglicanism because Spanish by then they were after the Reformation in the 1500s. Spain was with the Catholic Church and Britain was Anglican because of the split. Who the princes, the kings and the queens were head of the church and they were said to be heads of the spiritual order of the Christian order. They were princes of the church. Okay, and the Pope was the emperor. So so we always had Christianity, but the Great Revivalism is not necessarily Christianity. It was just African spiritual traditions mixed with some Christianity was in some Christian tradition because by then they were Christianizing the people. Okay.
Okay.
And of course, in the 1900s, in the turn of the 1900s, like the 1990, you find the Pentecostal movement, the rise of the evangelical movement and the Pentecostal movement in the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean in the 1990s. Okay, but
Okay, sir. Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah, man. And we'll talk. I guess hopefully we have some time to talk about Christianity some more and faith. The father of modern revivalism is um, known as Charles Finney, called the Great Revivalist. It's called the Great Awakening in America in a sense. So, but anyways, we're gonna stop here because I know it's late. It's 10:21. We're gonna stop here. We will come back next week. When we come back, we'll continue to review the timeline. We could look at 1873, Puerto Rico, late 1800s. We talk about when did Jewish people come here. Some Americans didn't realize that Chinese and Indians were coming here from the 1830s. So I didn't put that. Something is missing from this timeline. In 1833, when we got independence, um, sorry, when slavery was abolished, you also had, oh no, it never happened. It happened after 1865. In 1865, after 1865, you have, let me see here. Where is it? Following blah blah blah. Here we go. Um, the coming. I didn't put that here. Coming of the Indians and Chinese as indentured laborers to work the plantation. I should have added that. I need to update your things. All right. The coming of they came because when um, the Afri the Africans left the plantations once they learned of their freedom. All right, I need to save that. Okay, all right, we'll pick up from here where we left. This is important to note. 865 and blah blah blah. So I need to make a correction there, and then we will
Okay,
continue.
sir.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll pick up from where we left off, and continue reading. I want you to start reading. Okay, read neoliberalism if you can. Read They Came Before Us. They Came Before Columbus by Ivan Van Sertima. It's up. You can also go on YouTube and type in Ivan Van Sertima. They came before. He has a lot of videos, a lot of lectures talking about this, interviews on YouTube.
Sir, say the name again. Ivan what?
Ivan Van Sertima. It's on the syllabus.
So you speak too fast.
Sorry, Ivan Van Sertima. It's right here. See right here, guys. His name.
Okay.
Okay, you type it in the YouTube. I also have it on the YouTube page on my YouTube channel, but I'm gonna put it into Cabin Thought 2026 on my YouTube so that you guys can have it if you need to read it. But you can go on YouTube. It's there. Ivan Van Sertima. They came before Columbus, the African presence in ancient America. But you can just type his name in, and his lectures, 1 hour lectures, interviews is gonna come up. It's quite interesting. If you go on the syllabus, you can type in the Caribbean Reader. There's a link to the Caribbean Reader. Copy and paste it in your URL, and it's by Norman Gervin and Ian Meeks. The first couple of chapters it talks about the Caribbean being an invention, and of course, you can listen to the preface of my book Neoliberalism, which is available on the Audible for free. And those, okay, all right, guys, that's it for class. Thank you, God, Lord God. We thank you for this opportunity again, for an amazing time to share with the students, to explore our history. May you continue to guide us. May you continue to open up my mind to be able to share with the students, to facilitate this class. I pray that they will be open to some of the ideas that they are being exposed to, and that they will use the information that they have, that they will not sit on it, but they'll use it to become even better citizens, and that they will also facilitate learning and share what they have with those and develop intricate and strategic ways to share information. Bless their families, bless their loved ones, grant them favor, Lord God. Inspire them, inspire the students. And I pray that they will be inspired. Bless their finances, Lord God, and touch their whatever challenge that they are going through. I pray that you will give them insight to be able to overcome. Lord, those who are going through difficult situations, we pray for them too as well. Keep them safe. Show your love and your mercy, and help us to be loving people, Lord God, forgiving people, people of grace, and people who are firm and steadfast. These are the mercies we ask. In your name we pray. Amen.
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 Amen. Good night.
Amen. Good night, everyone. Good
Night,
night.
Good
everybody.
night,
Take care.
everybody. Bye.
Good night,
Bye.
sir.
Bye.
Good night, Taylor present. I'm present.
Bye,
Yes.
sir.
Bye bye.
Okay,
O'Neill is
sir.
going to mark the register and Chantel. All right. Take care. Be safe.